still welcoming people into this Zoom room, I'd love to invite you all just to mute for the first couple of minutes while we're still inviting people into this room. We love to start our regenerosity webinars with a few breaths together. We love to start our regenerosity webinars by, we always speak about regenerative design in different contexts. So this is a great moment to take that inward as well too. So as we're welcoming people into this Zoom room, I'd like to invite us all to find a comfortable moment for yourself to reflect. However that may be, you may like to close your eyes and take a moment to breathe deeply in and out, allowing your breaths to still you in this moment and welcome you here into this space together. And this webinar, as you are taking your deep breaths, I would like to invite you to reflect. At the moment, the world is experiencing so much suffering and fires in many spaces, some of us very close to us, in the US and in the Amazon rainforest, namely, and other spaces. Let us take a moment to reflect on the lives lost, human, animal, other non-humans, as we begin this session together today. Thank you. So our webinar today is titled Funding the Future. And we're very grateful and happy to be welcoming 5 very special guest speakers today: Atossa, Malia, Stephen, Sam, and Martin. We're very happy to welcome these guest speakers, which we'll hear from and be introduced to more so in a moment. But before we begin, just some other housekeeping. If you are agreeing with something that is going on, a great way for Zoom meetings to show your agreement or your resonance with something that is going on is to use this symbol. And so yeah, if you could keep your microphone muted until you're in the breakout group. So we're going to have time for us to engage and chat in smaller groups later on. But you can keep your microphone muted. But for now, please feel free to write in the chat box who you are and the organization you're from. And I'm going to pass on in a moment to Amanda, who's going to tell us a little bit more about who we are at Regenerosity. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you all. I'm Amanda Joy Ravenhill, honored to be Executive Director at the Buckminster Fuller Institute. BFI is one of the main partners of Regenerosity. Regenerosity is a program aimed at identifying, resourcing, celebrating, and maybe most importantly, learning from nature-inspired regenerative projects around the world. It arose from several of us organizations who had prize programs identifying regenerative projects and really realizing that we need to do a lot more. We need to resource these programs more fully. We need to connect them to one another and really kind of break down the power dynamics that often exist within philanthropy and wealth at large. We aim to be part of the Decolonizing wealth movement. For those who haven't read, there's a really great book by Edgar Villanueva called Decolonizing Wealth. And one of the things he calls for is for all of us to share stories of trust-based and participatory philanthropy, bringing people who are typically seen as beneficiaries of projects to the decision-making table. And so we'll be hearing a lot of stories of that today. That's one kind of common current throughout these webinars. So backing up a moment, we are in the midst of a huge transition globally. And we're all asking, how might we shift trillions of dollars from the old broken system to this new paradigm? How might we shift from a competitive understanding of the world towards a cooperative one? one that's really based in living systems principles rather than kind of the overly simplistic, linear, mechanistic, and extractive way of building an economy based on the production of weaponry to an economy based on what Buckminster Fuller called livingry. So here we are in the shift of that, and Regenerosity is dedicated to being part of that shift, being part of reorienting $10 billion by 2030 in the next 10 years toward regenerative projects, and really acknowledging that everyone is a wealth holder, just of different forms of capital. So how can we break down those power dynamics? There's 3 principles that we like to continue to come back to with Regenerosity, which are whole systems, reciprocal resources, and developing development. So whole systems, we support projects that combine ecological and social and economic benefits while also addressing root causes. Reciprocal resources, we're all about transforming financial capital into natural capital, into living capital, in cooperation with nature's amazing regenerative healing capacities. Buckminster Fuller liked to say that the universe is eternally regenerative. That's kind of the base state that we're all tuning into. And then the third is developing development. We're trying to create spaces like today where we can develop authentic relationships with one another and develop the field of development of philanthropy in order to really understand and break down the power dynamics that often exist between funder and fundees relationships and turn it into shared power and shared learning and mutual development, again, inspired by nature. We have Faith Flanagan here, who's also on the VFI team and program manager for Regenerosity. We have James, who you've already met, Ruth, who'll be moderating today from James and Ruth are both from the Lush Cosmetics team. And then we have Jean-Louis Robadet, who is here, who's supporting us with partnerships. And invite you all to join us in supporting Regenerosity. You can go to regenerosity.world to learn more. So today we'll be starting with Breakouts so you all can meet one another, find allies in this movement. Then we'll hear from our inspiring speakers, literally breath-giving to inspire. I'm so honored to have all of these people collected today. And then we'll go back into Breakouts and really be able to kind of like chew on the information together and continue to cross-pollinate with one another in this movement. And then we'll close and hear from everyone. We'll be turning this webinar into a lot of different media, into articles, into smaller videos, and also enabling it to influence our strategy as we continue to work with family foundations and private offices to redistribute some wealth around the world. So before I close, I would just like to invite this idea of the heart keeper. This is something that we've borrowed from the Threshold Foundation, and want to invite if anyone would like to be a heart keeper today. The role is to kind of put on a different set of lenses through which to experience this next time together and really kind of open your heart, open your kind of spirit space and see what is activated as people are sharing, and kind of be kind of an amplifier of the heart, an amplifier of more of the subtle energy. And if you want to do that, you can kind of just raise your hand or put it into the chat. And the goal is to kind of sit in a little bit of a more receptive space and tune into that. And then if you do hear something that is activated, or you see it in the screen in the videos of other people, just type it into the chat, and it kind of will create a little bit of a reverb or reflection around those moments. And then if we have time at the end, we'd love to hear from you too. So if anyone wants to raise their hand, just put it into the chat. And with that, I will pass it over to Faith. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Amanda. So now is a chance for you all to get to know each other. We'd love to put you all in small breakout rooms where you can talk a little bit about yourself and meet each other. This is a chance to talk about your name, your organization, and what agency do you feel you have the right now to support on the frontline communities if you have that opportunity. And this is including the ones that you may be a part of already. And how are you benefiting if you are Indigenous or a part of an Indigenous community who is currently working on a project? How are you benefiting? And then how do you feel you can best lend your support at this moment? So I'm going to put you all into breakout rooms right now, small breakout rooms. And the prompt is in the chat, and we'll be in the breakout rooms for about 7 minutes. So if you need help, you can just raise your hand or ask me to join your breakout room. And then I'll also put the prompt in the chat again. Here we are.
I hope you all had a good time getting to know each other. And I now have the very hard task of trying to condense really amazing wisdom of all of our panel guests in a short amount of time. So we're going to kick it off with some context setting, and then I will introduce the speakers. Each speaker is going to speak for a bit, and then we're just going to have a conversation. And I wanted to start with a quote that comes from Brazil, from the National Assembly for Indigenous Resistance. And this is a quote that is shared by the kind of coalition that is working on emergency funding and an emergency strategy around COVID-19 indigenous communities in Brazil. And it's a quote that I think really captures the time. So in times of pandemic, the collective struggle and solidarity that has rekindled in the world will only be complete with indigenous peoples, as the cure would not only be in the active principle, but in the activation of our human principles. So I think we're here today to explore how can we activate our human principles in how we move resources and help fund those that are looking after the commons. So I think this is a key principle of regeneration, of reciprocity. How do we resource those communities that are really resourcing, stewarding, and protecting the commons on behalf of all humanity? And to do that, we have invited some really amazing speakers that are touching very different parts of a very broad spectrum, from having to move emergency funding of just a few $100 to the hands of activists that are suffering death threats, to engaging in government partnerships for raising millions for communities stewarding, large amounts of land. So there are many strategies on how to resource frontline communities. And to help me set the context, I'd like to invite Stephen from the First Nations of Canada. I'll give a brief introduction. Stephen is the chief, or was the chief, of the Lutzel-Kidene First Nation in what we currently call Canada. And then president and CEO of the Community Development Corporation, an MLA in the General Assembly of the Northwest Territories, and chief negotiator for LKDFN, for the Lutzel-Kidene First Nation, on the establishment of the Taiden-Nen National Park Reserve, which is this enormous reserve of 26,000 square kilometers of traditional territory. And Stephen has a very holistic understanding of conservation and sustainable economic development for and with indigenous communities. And then he's dedicated to the advancement of indigenous nations and the resurgence of indigenous knowledge and governance as key features of ecological, cultural, and economic sustainability. So Stephen, over to you. Help me set the context for this conversation a little bit and share what you think are some of the common struggles across indigenous communities in the world, very different contexts, but some common struggles. And then what does solidarity look like, and how can we resource communities to protect the commons? Well, yeah, go for it.
I'll try.
And a few minutes, please. I know it's a huge complex.
Well, I think fundamentally, the challenges faced by indigenous peoples is in two parts: recognition and respect. Indigenous peoples globally, especially in those countries that were colonized, have not been viewed as human beings. Through acts of church, terra nullius, the doctrine of discovery, pretty much subjected and conditioned Westerners, people that have to control the world through financial and political and military wealth today, conditioned them to view Indigenous people as not as equal, much just like animals. So if you look at the destruction of the peoples, Indigenous peoples in the Americas, for example, and it correlates very clearly with the destruction of the land. Today, Indigenous people are still alive and still fighting for those lands, and still trying to transfer a way of knowing and doing, using their worldviews based on the relationship of their territories. Amazingly consistent worldviews right across the board, whether you're in sub-Saharan Africa, Siberia, northern or southern Canada, anywhere in the Americas, really, Australia. All Indigenous people's worldviews is that we don't really own the land. We have a responsibility to our territories, and to make sure that those territories can sustain future generations of their people. So the challenge today is to how do you support Indigenous nations to regenerate their authority and ability to influence how their territories are managed. And the more financial resources they have in their hands, the ability to implement their worldview in the relationship plans with their territories will come to fruition. Decolonization is a big requisite right across the world. Decolonizing individuals and nation states. Decolonizing language, for example. You know, we use language like land use plan. That's you know, if you use something, you tend to abuse it. Why not use land relationship plans? That type of decolonizing and looking at different ways we could use the language so that it speaks to more relationship respect instead of use and abuse. Global climate change and global warming, it's not a scientific issue. It's a social issue. Science understands what's going on, but it's the social science that's required to change the attitudes, so that we have more respect for people of different colors, different ethnicities, different regions, and different knowledge systems. That's the trouble right now. Is there's a part of the world in the northern hemisphere, we don't have the population, but we consume more than all the populations in the southern hemispheres. And we don't have any respect for those people over there enough that we are willing to change our ways of being.
And Stephen, sorry, since you're already speaking, when you said something, I know I'm changing the program here, but it really moved something in me that I think is important, which is about reconciliation and moving power, like moving power into the hands of Indigenous people and moving financial resources of Indigenous people, and the reconciliation that needs to happen. How do you see those things coming together? Because I also know you've done a lot of work on reconciliation, and I think this also sets a beautiful context for the conversation here today.
I'll use an example, my own example. Working with the International Bureau of Conservation and Ducks Unlimited in Canada, for example, I got them to give or donate $500,000 to the Treaty Tribal Corporation, my people's regional political body. And we used that $500,000 to get Canada and the government of Northwest Territories to the table to do a proper land relationship or land use plan for our region of 280,000 square kilometers. You know, our nation has been asking Canada, both levels of government, to do this land use plan, but they've been blaming each other, pointing fingers at each other, saying that we can't do it. It's your responsibility. It's your responsibility. But when we showed up at the table, that's when they showed up. It's when I told them, we're going to develop a plan with or without you. You're going to have to live with our plan. That's when they came to the table. But that's how you use money and power together, especially in jurisdictions like Canada, where the Constitution of Canada recognizes inherent Aboriginal and treaty rights prior to contact and prior to 1867. So you can use the political dynamics within the jurisdiction and create strategies to advance your agenda.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. And then, so I'm going to carry on introducing the next speakers from, and I'll start with Malia, because I think it's the difference between Canada and a government where you can come to the table and the government will meet you there, and a place like Brazil where the government is actually defunding any protection for Indigenous people. And we're moving to, I'm from Brazil, and we're moving to a space where we really have to support Indigenous community taking matters into their own hands without counting on the government. And one of the key players that supports getting money into the hands of the people who are really on the edge of protection is Malia Souza. She's the co-founder of the CASA Fund and currently leading the CASA Fund strategic development. She has dedicated her life to designing systemic strategies that assure philanthropic resources can reach the most excluded and vulnerable grassroots communities. She's a founding member of the Brazilian Philanthropy Network for Social Justice and leads the CASA Fund in many global and regional funders coalitions. I've also had heard about Amalia many times as the reputation of the person that can get money into the hands of, you know, people with no bank accounts that are hiding the middle of the forest because they're suffering death threats. Amalia, it's a pleasure to have you here. So just to build a little bit on what Stephen was saying, maybe introduce the difference of the context in Brazil and how are you supporting, how can you do that? Like, how can you move money straight into the hands of excluded and really vulnerable communities? Thank you.
Ooh. Actually, this is one of the creating visibility around, because that's the only way to do it. But here, I trust everybody. You know, it's a safe place to talk about this. So, well, I guess it's good to. I'm sorry. Is it really noisy? Because I ended up in a noisy region here. Can you? I hope it's not interfering with my sound here. Anyway, CASA. Well, the thing is, the people who set up this fund, we have a history of 30+ years as actors in the field, coming from different experiences. And I went to college in the U.S. I found out about Rainforest Action Network just about the next month after it was created. I was the first volunteer. I was very young, and I thought, oh, I can do something about the rainforest because there's a rainforest in Brazil. So that, you know, it started. I started thinking. Then next year I met this Indigenous leader who's still extremely, you know, outspoken about everything, called Ailton Krenak. That was in '86. I said, oh, I'm gonna learn what Indigenous peoples are doing, and realizing that resources just weren't getting to their hands, you know. And then you have movements, many aspects of protecting important ecosystems on the planet, of course. So you have international organizations that need to do their part in stopping the trade, you know, the influence of trading that can destroy ecosystems. So that's done a lot in Europe and the US, and very well funded. There's the strategy of protecting forests, but the old way, which with no people, you know, push people out, fence off the forest and then everything. This is not possible in countries like Brazil or any place in the global south, for that matter, you know, where people are starving. So there was this whole dichotomy, you know, this dilemma. You can't hug trees when people are starving, but then you can't save a place without actually resourcing the people to have better lives inside their ecosystem. And that was the gap. That's actually where resources weren't, except for one project here, one project there. You know, it's very hard to do it from the outside, from international structures into the local. So we figured out we needed a local system because we needed to manage local currency, and we needed to devise a mechanism that started with the real demand backward to what structure do you need, what kind of flexibility. Although you have to be impeccable, you have to pass all the big auditors on the planet, everything has to be accounted for. You still need something. We do the buffer. That's what we buffer. So we take that burden, all the bureaucratic systems, so that we simplify the process for the groups. And the reason we can actually reach so many of these very, very remote people is because we built everything up on networks of my relations and the others' relations and our almost 2,000 grantees in 10 countries relations, and that it just keeps going. That's actually the principle of systems, right? You are part of a system. If you are, then you get the demand really fast and you can respond faster, the whole feedback loop, the leverage points, all of these things that we actually exercise on a daily basis. So we have a huge amount of relationships that are already on the ground. So anytime that there's a challenge, we tap into those relations. They will help us go further into the territory, into the roots, to trust. So everything we do. So it's like we have the trust on the ground, and then we receive the trust of the funders abroad, and the bigger ones that couldn't do what we can. So they trust us to do it. So so basically the recipe is trust.
Thank you. That is amazing. And for me, just the concept of building a network of trust that can move resources in a way that's also regenerative, because you are regenerating social ties. For me, when we talk about regenerative philanthropy, that is it. And then, we could spend I could spend like an hour listening to each one of you. So it's just really sad that we don't have so much time. But I wanted to move now to Atossa, also because I think the work that you're doing span those two levels. So it brings together a lot of resourcing the indigenous communities directly, but also sitting down with governments for governance, like shared governance over large parts of the territory. So I think it brings a little bit what Stephen said to what Amalia said. So yeah, over to you, Atossa. And just a little introduction. Atossa is where are my notes? Here. Atossa is incredible. She's the founder and board president of Amazon Watch, one of the organizations with a really amazing reputation for centering indigenous people and really getting funds to fund what really matters. And now she's the senior strategist for the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative that is working together across Ecuador and Peru to protect one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth. So yeah, tell us a little bit more how does that relate to funding and the collaboration at that level of scale while still being responsive to the needs of the indigenous people? So how do you work across the levels of scale, moving resources across those levels? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. It's great to be here, seeing some friends and also a lot of great new people. So yeah, my work has been really about being a bridge between organizations, allies, funding networks with the indigenous and local organizations. And I've been spending the last, I was there when Malia was at Rainforest Action Network. We both were there way back when, some 30 years ago now. And my life's work's been in the Amazon, but also working with foundations for about 10 years with the Christensen Fund, helping be very thoughtful about the way we resourced and supported indigenous stewardship and governance of biodiverse landscapes. I'll just say that globally, what I learned as wearing my funder hat is that 80% of the world's biodiversity is on indigenous people's territories and under indigenous governance. So globally, if we care about life, indigenous peoples are being the stewards. In the Amazon, indigenous territories have lower deforestation rates than national parks. So indigenous peoples are actually the most effective guardians of of landscapes. And then when you look at philanthropy, this figure probably hasn't changed in a decade since we started using it, but less than 1%. In fact, when I was at the Christensen Fund, it was 1/8 of 1% of all philanthropic dollars go to indigenous peoples. And so here we have 80% of the world's biodiversity being stewarded by indigenous peoples, and less than 1%, not even close to 1% of philanthropic dollars going there. Now, having said that, indigenous work that we've been doing is really, like Malia said, is nurturing those relationships, nurturing those networks, supporting indigenous decision-making. So in the Sacred Headwaters region, we're working with 30 indigenous nations and indigenous populations in an area the size of Oregon, over 80 million acres. And this area is the most biodiverse part of the Amazon. It's also under assault. Let's remember, indigenous peoples are under assault with extractive industries and the emergencies that exist, climatic emergencies that are being caused by fossil fuel industry and deforestation. So they need our support in a way that we've never seen before. And the Amazon is reaching a tipping point. So the sooner we invest in these strategies, the more long-term chance we have of protecting the integrity of the biome, the Amazon biome as a whole. So time is of an essence. We are in an emergency, so emergency funding has to be part of our mechanism for getting funding out. We can't just take years of trial and error. We have to trust local stewardship, local networks to get the money to the areas that are in need. And remember that indigenous peoples are under assault right now. And so, so I would say that, scaling it up, to me, the Sacred Headwaters offers a lot of metaphors for working with indigenous peoples in helping uplift their priorities, listening for their priorities, uplifting their priorities, whether it's the oil spill or the extractive industries, or it's about life plans, or right now it's about upholding their traditional health system so they can respond to COVID, in addition to demanding support from government. So in what we've done in recently is really support indigenous peoples' articulation of their own vision and priorities, and now trying to combine all of this into fundable proposals where funders can say, hey, I do want to support renewable energy or alternative transportation or food sovereignty or livelihoods for indigenous peoples. And so to be able to put indigenous peoples in the governance of those, the Sacred Headwaters Initiative is an example of an initiative that's the governance group is primarily indigenous. There's 3 non-indigenous out of 12 indigenous. Same thing with the Amazon Emergency Fund. This summer I had the opportunity and the commitment to help launch the Amazon Emergency Fund. The Amazon Emergency Fund is being housed at the Rainforest Foundation, but it represents basically 30 NGOs and 10 of the major indigenous federations from all of the Amazon countries. The board is, again, primarily indigenous. It's basically 5 indigenous to 2 non-indigenous. And the indigenous peoples are helping decide where the funding goes because they know best how to channel and direct funding. So, so just to say that put indigenous peoples in decision-making roles, support collaboration, and support trust networks is the way we found to scale. And last thing I will say is that the Amazon Watch also set up an Amazon Defenders Fund, and we've been able to channel resources from the emergencies around the fires and from funders who say, we have a transaction cost. For every grant we make, we have to invest 1/3 of that grant into due diligence. We don't. We can get funding quickly to our trusted partners and allies we've been working with 10 or 20 years. So we've been able to channel over $1 million in the last year in small grants to indigenous frontline communities through the Amazon Emergency Fund. Those are just 3 examples I would give.
That's really good. Going back again to trust, and knowing that this is a network that has existed for a long time and has been building trust amongst many stakeholders, which then I think takes me to our next panelist. That's Sam Roddick, And yeah, for two, I wanted her to be part of this for two main reasons. One is the commitment to trust-based philanthropy, and then the commitment to, I say that the speed of decision making and the speed of funding needs to match the level of emergency that we have right now. And they think that philanthropy usually works on really long timelines with a lot of bureaucracy. I also work with giving a lush. I also know that we tell groups don't wait for funding for 3 months, or it might take 3 months to get a decision. When we're talking about emergency, we don't have that time. We just don't have that time. So I also wanted to hear from a funder who has been very innovative in how she approaches, you know, emergency and trust-based philanthropy. And Sam, to give just a little introduction, Sam is the powerhouse behind the Roddick Foundation that was set up by her parents. Her late mother is Anita Roddick, the founder of the Body Shop, and Body Shop and Lush have a relationship that goes back many, many years, including a shared strategy around using commerce to resource Indigenous communities as well. And the Roddick Foundation is a family-run, independent, and progressive organization dedicated to the support of visionary organizations and individuals who show leadership and results in making this a more just and kind world. So Sam, over to you to maybe share with us a little bit, how have been your most recent funding drives in order to really fund at the right level of emergency response in the situation in the Amazon? Maybe just share with us what you've been up to. Thank you.
Well, thanks. First of all, I want admission. I find this quite deeply uncomfortable, so I'm just going to admit it. So if I kind of like go off track and my adrenaline kind of makes me incoherent, like I'm just asking for everybody's forgiveness. I think the first thing is my family are activists. We're all activists. It's in the blood. It's in our culture. So we come to the table as activists, and whatever vehicles we utilize and whatever networks we have, whatever like connections and whatever we can do is in that framework, and it's just extra. Like our job is fundamentally to be extra. Boundaries are not really in my family's culture. It's like we're unboundaried. And I think we have no borders in terms of where we put our passion. So my parents started the Body Shop and they utilized it as an activist-based business. They really believed, based on their own journey in life and their own background, that the vehicle, the true purpose of business was to be a vehicle of social change, and they are proven within that in many different ways. They had complete control of their supply chain, and through their supply chain they did revolving loans to set up cooperative community-based businesses. And the thing is that they, in their lack of boundaries, they believed in relationships, friendship, and the spoken word. So essentially they were not a litigationally driven company. It was very much based on trust, but also understanding that we have a shared sense of welfare and a shared sense of philosophy. So they ended up working with a lot of different Indigenous communities around the world. And that's what I was born into, because I was born into the kitchen table of my parents' business, and I was taken on those trips. And I was basically kind of landed in the seat of some of the best thinkers, I think, this side of the century or last century, or in terms of my lifetime. And the first time that I was really introduced specifically to like the power and the intelligence of and the political strategy of the Brazilian Indigenous community was when they were asked to fund Altamira, the gathering in 1989 that stopped a huge hydroelectric dam, the brainchild of Payakan, who has sadly died of COVID. And through that, we made a lot of connections, or my parents did, and I was at that meeting, and literally it informed I was a teenager, it informed my whole philosophy of thinking. And that to me was like, I did not understand the gap in terms of how the West perceived Indigenous people to actually the truth of what you hear and feel when you're actually basically being kind of thrown into the discourse. So they worked very strong and hard, built up very many friendships. My dad speaks Kayapo particularly, and it's not just that community. So that is where I was born from. I haven't been a part of the funding world because I didn't really feel that, I felt funders and NGOs are born from a developmental perspective, an architecture of development. And for me, that is problematic within itself because it's based on economic injustice. That's the only reason we can give. So like, if you start on that basis, the whole thing is a problem. And I'm actually in service to grassroots movements because I want change and real change. And that's where real change for me occurs. So it's only been recently. So when my parents sold their business and my mum was like, I'm going to put all my money so I can give it away to, and she put it into the foundation. Sadly, she soon died after the initiation of that foundation, and we get the capacity to give that money. We give it in this very activist base. And the thing is, it's about trade. When you trade with a community, you're on equal ground, right? Like you're there and you're exchanging and it's for cash and you've got a product, you've got a price, and you have to haggle the value. And that is how they dealt with their trading partnerships. But it wasn't just about trade, it was about trading ideas, trading philosophies, but also about activism. And actually where do we join on a philosophical level and mirror each other on a philosophical level? So it was only recently when, two things. I started hearing a different language with funders that made me go, wow, I think funders are starting to hold an activist perspective. And that to me is exciting. It's like, where are the possibilities with conversations about decolonizing the self is kind of like, well, how the hell is that going to happen within a model that is deeply flawed, but brilliant that we're all up for basically wanting to explore it. And the other thing is Chief Raoni came to London last year. We ended up my family had a trauma around the Kayapo because they basically got death threats from the government because of what they were doing. The whole teams got beaten up. My dad was very, very traumatized by the experience of what happened in 2007. And there was a lot of wounding in terms of how we were hunted down as a family. So when Chief Raoni came last year and basically asked for our help to basically join in the fight against Bolsonaro, for me, it was like coming home, because I had spent many times within the Kayapo, kind of various different villages within the Kayapo. For me, all of where I believe we need to go is coming from Indigenous wisdom and intelligence. Like that is, sorry.
No, that's fine. We're finished.
So when Chief Raoni came to me and he said, will you help? Will you help us? It's like, how do you want help? He said, we want to have this gathering, a gathering for Indigenous people to talk about our strategy on how to fight Bolsonaro. I went, sure, I can do that. And he goes, I need it now. I was like, great. I ended up fundraising for that within 6 weeks. But within that 6 weeks, right, I learned he tried to get that funded for 5 years and no funders would fund him. He then got it funded once and the funders co-opted the gathering based on their own agenda. And it became about international Western need and perspective. And he kept on saying, I keep on trying to do this thing and nobody's listening to me. Well, within 6 weeks, we got it funded, but that was because my family had a direct historical relationship with the Kayapo, and we could guarantee, we had like from 1989 to 2007, we had incredible intimate relationships where we helped demarcate land, pay for bought land. We basically revolving loans in terms of setting up Brazil Nut Oil. We got involved with campaigns to stop the burning of the rainforest. So we had this historical relationship, so I could guarantee that. And the way the funders pursued it, not the funders that we got to support it, but the funders, the wider circle, I was actually shocked and surprised about the depth of racism that was occurring within the field. And I started to realize that actually maybe our historical relationship could be a bridge to how to build relationships. And that to me, when Pirasu happened, we all went in January, and it was an Indigenous-led meeting that basically was a 5-day strategy of how to fight Bolsonaro and all of the issues, I started to realize we had everything that we needed from that meeting. We had every way of figuring out how to support, what to support, and that there was no new ideas that were needed. They were all on the ground. All they needed was resource. So that for me was a really key stepping, that there was some place that I could step into to assist getting capital straight to the people on the front line. And the infantilization, the glorification of Indigenous people is perverse. And that is continuously happening. And I am also really heartened to be able to know that there are funders out there who are really trying to challenge themselves, including myself. And I think that is massively important. I'm just going to, I know I'm going over.
Okay, Sam. Yes, Sam.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
I'm not telling, I haven't even talked to you about the project. Sorry.
I know. We'll go back to you. This is so hard because I'm also super passionate about this, and I know how important this is. Where, it's like this: the communities are there, the strategy is there. It's just how do we get resources to them in a way that really builds on trust, not on bureaucracy.
Yeah, I think we have to change our bureaucratic processes. They are fundamentally exclusionary, particularly the written word, that actually, why can't we have oral grant making processes? I don't understand with this day of technology that we have not got that in place to allow people who cannot read and write have access to support and funds. And I think this is, we need to really deconstruct our processes massively, but we can't do it without actually allowing Indigenous communities to design the process. They have to design the process, and we have to rely on Indigenous intelligence to show us how to do that. Final. That's
amazing. Thank you. And thank you so much, Sam. I also wanted to just hear from our last panelist, and Martin, I'm going to ask you to speak together with Stephen on this. And it's to do with the UN Equator Prize. So just to give a brief introduction of Martin Somashu is the coordinator of the UNDP's Equator Initiative, and also contributed the UNDP's work on innovative finance solutions. He runs the Equator Prize, which recognizes and celebrates outstanding Indigenous peoples and local community initiatives that advance nature-based solutions for sustainable development. And I've really always appreciated the work of the Equator Prize, because I think it's about celebration and centering Indigenous communities and traditional communities. So Martin, you invited Stephen into this conversation as well. So I'd like you to speak briefly to the Equator Prize. Feel free to connect to what Sam just said, and how can we really decolonize the whole process, and whether there is anything that the Equator Prize is doing in order to, center Indigenous communities. And Steve, feel free to jump in to discuss with Martin this wider collaboration that's needed at the moment to resource Indigenous communities. As Sam said, the strategies are there. Stephen, you told us, you sat with the government, with the strategy. You just need those strategies resourced. So over to you two to join this conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Ruth. It's such a pleasure to be here, and lots of thoughts and feelings and emotions as I listen to the inspiring words of all the panelists. You made an introduction on what the Equator Prize is. Our winners receive $10,000, and while for many of them that's significant, it's really not the main reason why we award the Equator Prize. The main reason is that we see ourselves as a unit within the United Nations that supports replication and scaling up, and to really make the point that local initiatives have globally relevant impact, and that's why the United Nations should care about this. In UN policy speak, they call this global environmental benefits. And what I kind of wanted to point out is we've heard a lot about trust, and we've heard a lot about really the idea of trusting communities, not being bureaucratic. In many ways, that's what we're trying to do with the Equator Prize, is we're trying to build trust. We're trying to build trust in an ecosystem that trusts an institution like the United Nations because it has traction. This is not to say that the UN is not colonialist or that it's not flawed, because it is. No one would doubt that. But it does have a connection to certain systems and certain political ecosystems that are otherwise harder to get into. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to infuse indigenous and local voices into, and leadership into UN processes. And what really resonated with me was when Stephen said, we're trying to use the political dynamic you have to try to use the political dynamic in your jurisdiction. And that's where we as UN sometimes can step in. I'll give a short example. Last year, we had an Equator Prize winner from Indonesia, the Sungai Utik Longhouse community in northern Kalimantan. They had worked for 40 years to get their land rights recognized and formalized and have that sheet of paper that says, yes, this is yours now, no one can take it from you. And it was the Equator Prize that was told us after. This is not something I'm making up. This is independent people who have told us this. It was the Equator Prize and kind of this UN recognition that set in motion at last, the last little bit of that process that kind of carried it over the finish line, that at last the local government said, yes, we'll do it. And then we can, and then it was taken to the national government. So at heart, I'm an activist, but I'm trying to use the political systems that are in place to that benefit. Ultimately, do I want to change those political systems? Absolutely. But for now, in the absence of being able to do that from today to tomorrow, I'll try to work with that. So to work with those systems. So touch points we're doing beyond the prize and the prize money is communication, storytelling, advocacy. It's kind of this UN seal of approval that confers legitimacy and sometimes protection. It's the ability to partner better. It's government connections. And this is, I think, where I'd like to bring Stephen in, is you have been able to set up a very powerful structure where you were able to bring governing partners to the table, and then kind of the money you raised yourself, and create a really viable system of governments for Taiden and Nene. So it would be interesting to hear a little bit about how exactly you managed to do that.
Okay. Thanks. Before I get to Taiden and Nene, I want you guys to get your heads around the possibility in Canada for Taiden and Nene to be replicated across the country. Right now, I work with, like I said, Indigenous Leadership Initiative that's supporting 23 projects that's on the go. I also work with an organization called Conservation Through Reconciliation, which is an academic process that we have about 40 some partners, all the major NGOs in Canada, including the number of First Nations governments, and also different departments of government of Canada, Fisheries and Oceans, Parks Canada, Environment Canada, CWS, and about half a dozen universities. We created ourselves to support Indigenous leadership in conservation in a spirit of reconciliation. So that's happening on one level there. So we're working there together to push and pull in the same direction, so that all these different angles are not battling each other or tripping over each other or confusing Indigenous governments. And what we're hoping to do is take their resources and apply them where it's needed within the Indigenous nations. I talked about 25 or 23 projects that ILI is currently supporting in partnership with Canada. There was an expression of interest by over 120 First Nations and Inuit and Métis communities across Canada that are expressing an interest in creating their own Indigenous protected and conserved areas within their territories. So take that, and what we did in Souza, is that we took the leadership. It was a mandate given by the elders. When diamonds were discovered in our territory, we've seen the largest staking rush that mankind's ever seen. You know, they had choppers dropping stakes into people's yards, not in our community, but in other communities. But there massive amount of land was staked for exploration purposes. That's when the elders said we need to protect the heart of our territory. So instead, what we did is we just we worked internally. We explored best options, best practices in terms of protected areas, type of protected areas, or conserved areas, and then we asked the elders to draw us a map which area they want us to protect. So they gave us a map. It was an area of 55,000 square kilometers. And then we used our own law to declare that as an Indigenous protected and conserved area. Then we went and approached Canada, based on the research we did and the type of protected area that their elders wanted, which is hard protection from industrial development. We chose Parks Canada as a partner because they have the best legislation, and to support the conservation economy, which was built into the planning of Saigon and Ninit. You know, the way we're going to be using Saigon and Ninit is to continue our way of life, or continue our economies, but also introduce tourism and academic tourists into our territory so that we could share our love for Saigon and Ninit, but also our ways of knowing and doing, our science, our ideologies and philosophies, and how we use those in our relationship with our territory. We want to be able to share that with the world at the same time, you know, make some money with it. But one thing that one mandate that I was given that was so important is that because of trust issues and because of past colonial policies of public governments and crown governments in Canada's case, the elders said we need to have our own source of funds. We need to have our own source of funds so that we don't depend on Canada or any other government to fulfill our end of the responsibility and to ensure that our partner in Canada does not take the responsibility and hold away from us in the management and operations of Saigon and Ninit. So the concept of a trust fund was born at that point in time, and we've knocked on doors. And based on we did the financial analysis using financial people in the finance that understand this stuff, and the cost of what we expect our cost to be, not only for our staff, the training, the insurance, the equipment that they need, but also to support our communities and members in tourism development, tourism product, equipment they need, and the marketing, and also to support any organizations that can demonstrate that they could benefit Saigon and Ninit. Those are the revenues for the trust fund that we expect, but the true cost is just to support our staff. And based on that cost, we figured we needed $30 million. A $30 million trust where the principal never gets touched. And what we did is we raised $15 million from people like yourselves, and we had Canada to match it. And what we did with Canada, what Canada does, and when they create national parks in this country, they create an advisory committee, and they have annual funds that goes to the advisory committee or their Indigenous communities in that area, and the communities use that to participate in the management of these parks. What we said is no, we want our own money, and what we did was, okay, we need $15 million to create a $30 million trust. We want you to match that 15 we got. And it's an investment for the taxpayers, because in 27 years, that $15 million pays for itself, and the taxpayers of the country are no longer on the hook to support Tlusagay and the people of Tlusagay and in that area in the management and operations of Saigon and Ninit, which is very, very, very enticing for the governments.
Stephen, this is for me super interesting because it looks at this win-win-win model, you know, where when we really, it was really the title of this webinar, which is how do we resource indigenous communities to protect the commons? What you've just explained is exactly that. Is the government investing in the commons, knowing that long term they're just increasing the wealth of the territory, the value of the territory, and reducing dependency on the state, right? Because it's promoting in a way sovereignty and economic sovereignty of the territory.
Exactly.
And while protecting the land and, you know, jobs and all of that. Like, so there is an economic output, there is a social output and an environmental output.
And what's important,
that's really interesting.
There's a fund there that's there in perpetuity that governments and industry know that fund is owned by the First Nation in that community, and they could use revenues from that fund to defend their territories outside of those protected areas. Industry knows that, government knows that. You have a little war chest that they could use to manage your entire territory. For example, my community's traditional territory, because of our location, is 200,000 square kilometers. So 26,000 is not a very big chunk of land for us, but we still have to manage a bigger territory. But the other areas of investment in support of Indigenous peoples is very important at the front end as well. Indigenous people having to have financial and the technical resources from their partners allows them to take the leadership role in developing that relationship and legal contracts that we use to create like in the internet. So that the governments you don't use their money to negotiate with them. Therefore, that's the only way we got Titan and Nene to a point where it's more of a joint venture, where Canada and Kusage are creating an agreement where we're creating Titan and Nene together, we co-govern it together, and we co-manage and operate together with our own resources.
Thank you so much. Brazil had a similar thing, which was a fund that was completely destroyed by the current government. But for a long time, this shared governance between indigenous communities and the government and civil society worked really well with funding from German and Norwegian governments, and now it's all being released. So I wanted to move again to South America, and Atosa, I have a question actually from the audience that I think is pertinent to this conversation with Stephen, which is, what is the balance between charitable funds, government policy, and market-based solutions? So when we look at the Sacred Headwaters, for example, how are you addressing like multiple sources of funding, and how is the balance between those different types of financial mechanisms? Sorry, we're getting to the nitty-gritty of financing now.
It's a great question. We are in a process of coming to some answers in those questions. I mean, we are embarking on this very ambitious participatory bioregional planning for a 10-year future vision. Of course, these people say we need more than 100-year vision, but for the next 10 years, what Indigenous stewardship and governance means. And what we cannot separate what happens in territory to support protection and well-being and harmony and ecological protection of the territories from the systemic drivers, which are the economic system, the extractive model of neoliberal economics that's constantly trying to take wealth out of the commons and put it into the private sector. So we also have this fighting these systemic issues. And so to answer your question, I think we're looking at several frameworks. One is the framework of supporting Indigenous life plans. And how much is that? What does it cost? How does it work? Within those life plans, a lot of the money is right now is invested in the participatory process for Indigenous peoples to determine their own governance structures for a massive area. We're talking about it's bigger than the state of Oregon. So that process, that's investing money, nonprofit money in creating vision, shared vision and shared plans, and more of things that can be later supported through other vehicles like investments or seed funding or loans, which have to do with bringing better education, transportation, livelihood alternatives, and supporting livelihood alternatives, basically entrepreneurship, but not so much from a traditional perspective of entrepreneurship, which has been take resources out, take it to market and sell it, get resources and then meet your basic needs. But from a perspective of looking at, you know, food sovereignty and self-reliance and good education and the skill sets that Indigenous youth need for governing rainforest territories, managing biodiverse territories, supporting river basin restoration, fish population, tracking wildlife corridors, supporting their own well-being, health and, you know, health and well-being, quality of life. So that is in the process. We're working on figuring that out. We're also looking at, the fact is, the biggest systemic issue is that these territories have been ignored by the government. The government has failed in its responsibility to invest properly in education, healthcare, transportation, well-being of the Indigenous populations. It's only been extracting resources, and its condition for investing more resources is that it's going to extract more to get royalties to invest more. And we're saying, no, we want to leapfrog that. We want to, you know, Indigenous peoples are calling for leaving fossil fuels in the ground, leaving the minerals in the ground. 15% of Ecuadorian Amazon has just been leased to mining. As oil prices drop, government's pushing mining. So Indigenous people are saying, leave fossil fuels in the ground, invest in our own self-reliance as a bioregion. But Ecuador is under a huge, again, systemic, Ecuador and Peru is under systemic forces. For example, international debt to international creditors, and everyone from Credit Suisse and Chase Manhattan Bank to the World Bank, the IMF, China, and bilateral institutions. So we are looking at debt, large-scale debt swap that could help release billions of dollars of government's own money to invest in these things by not having to pay the debt. And then, you know, so then there will be investment possibilities for investments, but Indigenous peoples are very clear about those. They're not the traditional investments where you know, equity investments. It's more about providing loans and working capital and seed funding, more so than ownership transfer. And, you know, and of course, we're seeing lots of mechanisms like ecosystem services and payment for ecosystem services in red. Indigenous peoples that we work with have tried to stay away from that. They're looking for alternative mechanisms that support well-being and livelihoods without tying it to, again, private asset creation of commons. We're trying to stay away from private creation of the commons. But it's very difficult because that's where most of the money comes. In fact, every dollar that comes from governments to Peruvian Ecuadorian government has to go through some RED programs for reducing emissions from deforestation, which kind of is a straitjacket I think we need to work around. And then last thing I would just say is, you know, this concept of ecological debt. Why should the world pay countries in the Amazon so that they can provide better, you know, support, everything from, you know, conservation basic income or some kind of a universal basic income, some kind of, you know, support into services, more services, universal basic services for, and support in transitioning you know, people who are working in the extractive industry, transitioning to a restorative, regenerative economy sector. All those require government funds. Why should the world support countries like Ecuador, Peru in investing that in their own people? And I think that there's many reasons. Obviously, the Amazon is a vital organ for the entire biosphere. We can't have life on this planet without the Amazon. It's a global commons. Secondly, there is a tremendous amount of wealth transfer that's happened from you know, oil and mining and resource extraction to the north. So there is a tremendous amount of extraction and I would say environmental and social ecological liabilities that the world owes the people and the ecosystems of the Amazon. So we have to think about wealth transfer at that level. And lastly, I would say we have to look at this idea of ecological debt, which is a really brilliant concept. I encourage everyone to look at it and see philanthropy as one vehicle for reversing, paying back the ecological debt. We are, you know, the North has produced and consumed and is responsible for most of what's in the atmosphere, most of the degradation globally. What we have to do is find ways to redistribute wealth and pay back the ecological debt. So that does mean mostly government funding, but philanthropy is building the mycelial network. It's creating the trust networks. It's supporting the processes of advocacy and coalition building and collaboration that then say, here's what we think should be invested, here's where I think money can go. And last thing I will end with is I've been reflecting a lot about money, and money is like water. Money flows like, water flows. Too much flow too fast will cause erosion of democracy, erosion of communities and social networks and trust networks. Too little money creates scarcity and competition, and that's unhealthy too. So getting the flow right, getting the flow of resources right, requires, just like the way permaculture looks at water moving through the landscape, how do we do that? We do that through really strong, resilient networks. Philanthropy plays that role. And philanthropy plays the role of mobilizing advocacy, mobilizing support and political will, so that private sector can come in with financing, and so can governments from other countries come in with this reversal of ecological debt. So that's, I know that's somewhat theoretical, but in practice, I will say in about 3 months, we will have a really robust bi-regional 10-year vision, which combines the Indigenous people's own life plans for what they see as important investments in their territories. And we're going to try to collate and develop this for the world. So hopefully that with you all. Thank you.
Thank you. I love this idea of philanthropy helping to build a mycelial network so bigger funds can flow, and really funding the visioning and the collaboration and the partnership and the development of these strategies. I'd like to end with Amalia and Casa, and I mean, probably 1-2 minutes, Amalia, for you to say, what are some of the really successful, innovative ways of funding Indigenous communities you have seen lately that you think, we should close this webinar with? Like, what do you feel is hopeful, or that you already see philanthropy shifting, or just maybe some stories from the field, and then we'll finish the panel.
I think this before, just making it clear, when you look at a system like the Amazon, you don't have Indigenous peoples holding important, the most preserved territories, but you have also others who came and learned from them, the extractivist communities, the Quilombola, all these completely excluded sectors of society that are just as vulnerable, and that have adopted many of the Indigenous ways, and that have been very creative in some of the structures for protection, like extractive reserves, for example, that came from the time of Chico Mendes and has been built up. The thing is, it's not about an amount, and I like the way that Souza just said, you to be able to dose and to know what is the appropriate amount, you really have to be very close. I really, when you talk about small grants, it can go, and we don't manage very tiny grants unless we have we have donor advised funds, like we're doing this partnership now with Product Foundation and others there in the UK. It's a driven purpose, but we manage from 5,000, usually average is $5,000 to $15,000, because we were trying to reach the communities that were completely underfunded. And you can't dump a lot of money. Now you create more divisions and more problems. It has to be their demand and their design, and they have to learn how to think through a budget. And they, it takes time to acquire certain skills, and we help that. And then you have other strategic institutions in the region that work with a lot of the groups, and they are also underfunded. And then you've seen situations like you just mentioned in Brazil, where there have been billions in this conservation vision poured into the Amazon, with structures that depended on government agencies, and all of that collapsed because a new government came, and all of that money went down the drain. So it really, I think it's a very important learning period right now for us, even during COVID. There's grades, and you need to be very close, and you need to rely on the people who know the territory, and you consult and you hear. And then So we are now doing, funds from, that's our main area, because that's where mostly the bigger funders cannot break down in small grants. But a small grant doesn't mean that it's disconnected, that we just pick one here and one there. It's the whole thing is the systemic. You look at the whole ecosystem. What's going on there? What's going on in the Peruvian Amazon and the Ecuadorian Amazon and the Brazilian Amazon? What are the challenges? Who's doing the work? Who has the funding? Who has the studies? And who needs to be engaged in this whole process so that we actually reach? And those usually are the smaller, the communities that have been abandoned completely historically. So that's the one we are now managing from 1,500 grants to manage some of their larger grants here, and we agreed to do it because it goes together with the bigger vision of the region. So anyway, I think it's very important, these two elements. You really need to those. You need to be close. You need to know. And there are two, I think, just to finish, there are two big lines that kind of resonate with that and what we've been hearing here. One, that you don't need too many grants or a lot of grants, but it's a solution-based approach. There's a lot of communities that they have their territory, they need tools for the vigilance, they need GPSs, they're learning, it's all this technology, or they need solar panels so they can buy equipment and run and process fruits they pick from the Amazon, and they can improve. Very soon,
Amalia,
they don't need a grant anymore. They're already on their way. Yes, you're breaking?
No, just the sound, the connection is not so good.
No, just, okay, well, just the last thing. So one area is solution-based, and the other is right defense. And that's where we're, of course, the biggest challenge has been lying for years, and now more than ever, it's people who need to protect their territories and their ways of life against, all the insanity of what's going on. And that's a very fragile, very delicate work, and that's a long-term process. And you need to stick, we as funders, we need to be together with them in the long haul, together with each other and together with these communities. So, I hope I answered. I forgot the question.
I think it was possible to get the gist of what you were saying. And folks, we were going to have another breakout group. The conversation is so interesting and so much stuff. So I think if you have time and can stay a little bit longer, we're going to go into just a few minutes. What we find is that these conversations are very rich and very full. We talked about trust. We talked about the activist role of philanthropy. Amalia was talking about the long haul partnership between funders and communities, especially when we're talking about defending territories, and especially if we discuss multiple solutions that don't rely on just governments, because we know governments change. So it's quite a lot. So we're going to have 2 minutes in breakout groups, or just 2 minutes in the breakout group now, just for you to just perhaps download what's alive in you right now. But then before we go on to the breakout group, I'll just invite Faith and James to lead us through it. Okay, over to you, Faith and James, and maybe just introduce, I'll put in the chat the web links for you to engage more with Regenerosity as well. Thank you. Thank you to the amazing panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. So this is just a chance to, and an opportunity to speak about what's alive for you. And there's been a lot of questions in the chat, and would love to capture some of those questions. And quite a few of the speakers have put their emails in the chat, so we have an opportunity to actually directly engage with them. So this is just what's alive for you from this conversation, and it's very short. So yeah, we'd love for you to talk about what's alive for you.
We'll be sending out notes and all the links that were shared in the chat, and a recording of this so you can share it with other people. And if you'd like to continue the conversation, we are hosting the Regenerosity network and community on a platform called Hilo. And so we'll put that chat into link here, and that'll also be in the follow-up email. And yeah, just so grateful for all the speakers today, for joining us, for all the work that you're doing, for really leading the way in participatory and trust-based philanthropy, and just all that we need to do in order to build a future that works for all. So very grateful. And if any of people who kind of had the heart keeper role on want to post into the chat, please feel free to do that now. And for anyone who can stay on, we'll be on just for a couple more minutes. Thanks, everyone.